She smiled at me. She made tea. She called me her sweet mother-in-law, and then she filmed me for 2 million people and told them I was losing my mind. She forged my signature. She hired a doctor. She signed a contract to sell my house before the ink on her marriage certificate was dry. What she didn't know was that my husband had spent the last year of his life building walls she couldn't see, and I had spent the last 8 months making sure she walked straight into them. I have attended more charity galas than I can count. After 20 years on the federal bench in Nashville, Tennessee, and another decade before that practicing law on Church Street, I have learned that the most consequential conversations in this city rarely happen in courtrooms. They happen at parties. They happen near open windows, just beyond the edge of the chandelier light, between men who assume no one important is listening. That is a mistake people have been making around me my entire life. My name is Carolyn Whitfield. I am 67 years old, a retired federal judge, and a widow of 8 years. I live alone in the house. My late husband Thomas and I built together on the western edge of Nashville, a stone and timber property that has been in the Whitfield name for going on 30 years. People in certain circles know who I am. People in other circles think they do. On a cool Friday evening in October, those two groups were about to discover the difference. The gala was held at Belmont Estate, a restored antebellum property just south of Hillsborough Village that the Children's Literacy Foundation rented every autumn for their annual fundraiser. I had supported the foundation for 11 years, since its inaugural dinner when the woman who founded it stood up and gave a speech without notes and without apology, and I wrote a check because I believed her. The room that evening was everything a Nashville autumn gala is supposed to be: warm lighting, white tablecloths, the smell of bourbon and hothouse flowers, and the particular hum of a crowd that has dressed carefully and arrived with intention. I moved through it with the ease of long practice, a word to the foundation's director near the entrance, a handshake with a circuit court judge I had mentored years ago, a glass of champagne I carried more than I drank. I was not there to be seen, exactly. I was there because showing up matters, because the foundation does good work, and because after 8 years of widowhood I have learned that stillness, while necessary, can become a habit if you are not careful. By 9 o'clock, the speeches were done and the crowd had loosened into smaller clusters. I slipped out through the side door onto the stone terrace that ran the length of the building's east wing. The air was sharp and clean, the way October air in Tennessee knows how to be just cold enough to remind you that summer is genuinely over. String lights ran along the terrace railing. Below, the garden was dark and quiet. I was not the only one who had stepped out for air. 2 men stood near the far end of the terrace, their backs partially turned, voices low but not low enough. They were both well-dressed, one in a charcoal suit, the other in navy, and they held their glasses with the relaxed confidence of men accustomed to being the most important people in whatever room they occupied. I recognized neither of them. That, in my experience, is rarely a coincidence at an event like this. It usually means they are new to Nashville, or they have been careful about who they allow to know their faces. I stayed where I was. I set my champagne glass on the stone railing. I looked out at the dark garden as though I were simply enjoying the evening air. And I listened. The name came within the first 30 seconds. Not a person's name, a property. The Whitfield property. Said the way men say things when they believe the matter is already settled, when the conversation is less about deciding and more about confirming what has already been decided. The one in charcoal did most of the talking. He mentioned a 60-day acquisition window. He mentioned a financial institution, he did not name it, but he used the phrase already cleared at their end, which told me the preliminary approval had been given. He mentioned a development group with a name I did not recognize, and a figure. He said it quietly, but I have spent decades training my ears in courtrooms where people speak quietly on purpose that was consistent with the assessed value of my home. The one in navy asked about a transition arrangement. The one in charcoal said it was being handled on the family side. Neither of them looked in my direction once. I stood there for what felt like 3 full minutes, though it may have been less. I kept my posture easy. I kept my eyes on the garden. When the 2 men finished their conversation and moved back inside, I waited another moment before I turned around. I picked up my champagne glass. I smoothed the front of my jacket. Then I walked back into the gala, found the foundation's director, and told her it had been a lovely evening. I said goodnight to the circuit court judge. I retrieved my coat from the coat check, tipped the young woman behind the counter, and walked to the parking lot where my car was waiting. I did not rush. I never rush. But by the time I turned onto the highway heading home, the lights of Nashville spreading out behind me in the autumn dark, I was no longer thinking about the party. I was thinking about the name they had used so casually, so confidently, between themselves on that terrace, as though it were simply a line item, an asset, a transaction waiting to be completed. They had called it the Whitfield property. I call it home. And I had exactly 60 days to make sure they understood the difference. I did not sleep well. That is not unusual for me. I have not been a sound sleeper since Thomas passed, and the house has a way of settling into the quiet that I have never entirely made my peace with. But that Saturday morning, I was awake before 5, sitting in the dark with my thoughts moving the way they do when something has shifted and your mind is trying to catch up with what your instincts already know. By the time the sun came up over the ridge behind the property, I had made coffee and carried it down the hall to Thomas's study. I do not go in there every day. Some mornings I pass the door without stopping, the way you learn to navigate around the spaces a person leaves behind. But that morning I went in, set my cup on the corner of his desk, and sat in the old leather chair he kept by the window, the one that faces the back garden, where the oak trees he planted 30 years ago have grown tall enough now to throw shade across the entire yard by mid-morning. I sat there and looked out at those trees, and I let myself remember. Thomas Whitfield was not a man who said a great deal. He was a structural engineer by training and by temperament, a man who expressed himself in load-bearing walls and reinforced foundations rather than in speeches. When we met, I was a 31-year-old attorney with a reputation for arguing until the other side ran out of breath. Thomas was 34, quiet as a Sunday morning, and entirely unbothered by my tendency to fill a room with words. He used to say that good structures do not need to announce themselves. They simply hold. We built this house together when Daniel was 3 years old. Thomas drew the plans himself, not as a professional exercise, but as a private one. He chose the timber framing because he said it would outlast both of us. He chose the stone because he wanted something that could not be easily altered. Every room was designed with intention, every window placed to catch a specific quality of light at a specific time of day. The study faced west, so the afternoon sun would come in low and warm across the desk. The kitchen faced east, so the morning would begin with brightness. Thomas thought about things, the way engineers think about things, in terms of what will hold, and for how long, and under what conditions. He thought about the house the same way. 8 years ago, when the doctors gave us the kind of news that rearranges everything, Thomas did not spend his remaining time in grief. He spent it in preparation. I did not fully understand that at the time. I understood it as love, which it was, but it was also something more precise than love. It was architecture. He was building one last structure, and he was building it to hold. 6 months before he passed, Thomas sat across from me at this very desk and slid a document across the surface toward me. It was a trust agreement, an irrevocable living trust, drafted by an estate attorney he had retained without telling me, placing Whitfield House and the surrounding property beyond the reach of any future claim, any court petition, any financial arrangement I might enter into, either willingly or otherwise. He had thought through every contingency with the same methodical care he brought to every structure he ever designed. I remember looking up from the document and asking him why. He was quiet for a moment in the way he always was when he was choosing his words carefully. Then he said, "The house stays, Caro, no matter what comes." I asked him what he was expecting to come. He looked out the window at those oak trees, the same ones I was looking at now, and said he was not expecting anything in particular. He simply knew that the world has a way of testing what you have built, and he wanted to make sure this one had been built correctly. I signed the document that afternoon. We did not discuss it again. He passed 8 months later, on a Tuesday morning in November, with the windows open because he had always preferred the sound of the wind in those trees to any music I could have played. I held his hand and I did not cry until I was alone, because that was the way he would have wanted it quietly, without making the moment about the grief instead of the man. I had not thought about that trust document in a long time. Sitting in his chair that Saturday morning, coffee going cold in my hand, I thought about it now. Whatever those two men had been discussing on that terrace the night before, whatever arrangement had been made, whatever timeline had been set in motion, they had done it without knowing about that document. They had made their plans around a house they believed was available. They had calculated costs and windows and approvals without accounting for the one thing Thomas had put in place precisely because he understood that people would someday try. He had seen this coming, not the specific shape of it, but the general nature of it, the way a structural engineer sees the weak points in a design before anyone else does. I set down my coffee cup. I looked at his desk, still arranged the way he left it, the brass lamp in the corner, the small photograph of the two of us at the Grand Canyon the summer Daniel turned 10. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Meg. Margaret Holloway had been my closest friend for 25 years and one of Nashville's most respected estate law attorneys for longer than that. If anyone could tell me exactly what that trust meant in the current circumstance, what it protected, what it did not protect, and what someone with enough motivation might try to do around it, it was Meg. She picked up on the second ring. She always does. "I need to talk through something," I said. "I'll put the coffee on," she said. Meg did not answer. I left a message short, the way she prefers them, and set my phone face up on the kitchen counter where I would hear it if she called back. Then I poured myself a second cup of coffee, carried it to the sitting room, and opened my laptop. I told myself I was simply going to look. That is what I told myself. My daughter-in-law's name is Sloan Whitfield. She is 34 years old, and she married my son Daniel 3 years ago in a ceremony at a rented vineyard outside Franklin that cost more than I will say out loud. I wore a blue dress and I smiled in every photograph, and I said what a mother is supposed to say at her only child's wedding. Sloan is polished in the way that certain people are polished, every surface smooth, every word chosen, every gesture landing exactly where she intends it to land. She works, as she describes it, as a financial content creator. She produces videos about wealth management, lifestyle, and what she calls intentional living. She has, by her own frequent mention, built a significant following on a popular video platform. I had seen perhaps 3 of her videos before that Saturday afternoon. I typed her name into the search bar. What came back stopped me for a moment. Not because I was unprepared for what she did, I understood in a general sense that she produced content online. What stopped me was the scale of it. 2.1 million subscribers. A channel she had been building for just over 2 years, with a consistent posting schedule and a visual style so carefully maintained, it looked like the output of a small production company rather than a single person working out of a home. The series that caught my eye was called Caring for Family. It had begun, according to the posting dates, approximately 8 months ago. The first video in the series opened with Sloan standing in a kitchen, my kitchen. I realized within the first 10 seconds, though the angle had been chosen to obscure the window above the sink, that I would have recognized immediately. She was speaking in the warm, unhurried tone she uses when she wants to seem trustworthy. She talked about the importance of showing up for aging parents. She talked about patience. She talked about the particular challenges of caring for someone who, as she put it, doesn't always remember things the way they happened and needs a little extra guidance these days. She was talking about me. I watched the second video, then the third. I watched them the way I used to read case files methodically, without allowing my reaction to interfere with my comprehension. In the fourth video, she walked through the back garden, the camera moving slowly across Thomas's rose beds and the stone path he laid by hand the summer we moved in. She described it as her favorite place to think. In the seventh video, she filmed the front hallway, the wooden floors. Thomas refinished himself, the narrow table where I keep the ceramic bowl Daniel made in a pottery class when he was 9 years old. She described the house as a project and mentioned, in a tone suggesting affection, that the space has so much potential. By the 12th video, I had opened a fresh document on my laptop and begun taking notes. The word she used most often to describe me, across the series, was fragile. She never said it unkindly, that was the craftsmanship of it. She said it the way a person says it when they want the listener to feel sympathetic rather than alarmed. She spoke about my confusion regarding appointments, my difficulty managing the household, my need for support with decisions that had become a little overwhelming. In one video, filmed in the sitting room where I was now seated, she looked directly into the camera and said, with evident tenderness, that sometimes the people we love most need us to make decisions on their behalf, even when they are not quite ready to ask for help. I paused that video. I sat with it for a moment. Then I kept watching. I went through every video in the series. I noted the date of each one, the location within the house, the specific language she used to describe me or the property. I noted the comments section 2.1 million subscribers produces a substantial response, and the comments were largely sympathetic. Viewers thanked Sloane for her openness. They said she was an inspiration. Several said they were going through something similar with their own families and found her content comforting. A few asked questions about the house itself, whether it was a historic property, whether she planned to renovate. She had answered those last ones carefully. She said the future of the space was still being considered. When I reached the final video posted 11 days ago, filmed in the upstairs hallway outside the room that had been Daniel's as a boy, I closed the laptop and sat quietly for a few minutes. 47 videos, 8 months of content. My kitchen, my garden, my hallways, my husband's rose beds. My name, never spoken directly, but present in every frame as the subject of her careful, patient, well-produced concern. Not once had she asked me. Not once had she mentioned to me that she was filming inside this house, using images of my home and descriptions of my character to build an audience of 2.1 million people. Not once had she said, "Caro, I would like to share this with the world." Not once had she asked whether I minded being described, in front of strangers, as a woman who could no longer manage her own affairs. I thought about Thomas, and the document he had drafted with such quiet precision, and what he had understood about the nature of the world that I was only now beginning to see clearly. Then my phone rang. Meg, returning my call. I picked it up on the first ring. "I need more than coffee," I said. "Bring the whole morning." Meg had suggested we wait until Monday. Not because the situation was not urgent, she understood from my call that it was, but because Meg Holloway has practiced estate law in Nashville for 31 years, and she does not make assessments on incomplete information. She wanted the weekend to pull the original trust documents from her files, review the current Tennessee statutes on irrevocable trust protections, and come to our meeting with something more useful than reassurance. That is the way she has always worked, and it is one of the reasons I have trusted her for as long as I have. We met at her office on West End Avenue at 7 in the morning, before her first scheduled appointment. Meg is 61 years old, trim and precise, with silver hair she keeps short, and a manner that reminds you, within the first 5 minutes of any conversation, that she has spent 3 decades being the most prepared person in the room. She was at her desk when I arrived. Coffee already poured 2 cups, black, the way we both take it, and a manila folder open in front of her that I recognized as the trust documentation Thomas had filed all those years ago. She did not greet me with small talk. That is not Meg's way. "Sit down," she said. "Let me tell you what we have." What we had, according to Meg's review, was a well-constructed, irrevocable living trust that Thomas had drafted with considerable foresight. Under the terms of the trust, Whitfield House and the surrounding property had been placed beyond my individual ownership in a legal sense, which meant that I could not sell it, transfer it, or use it as collateral. But more importantly, neither could anyone acting on my behalf without specific authorization. The property was held in trust for the benefit of the Whitfield family line, with provisions that Meg described as unusually thorough for a document of its era. Thomas used a good attorney, she said, which from Meg is the equivalent of high praise. The trust had been structured to withstand the most common forms of legal challenge. It could not be dissolved by a simple court order. It could not be overridden by a standard power of attorney. It had survived Thomas's passing intact, and in the 8 years since, no one had filed any motion to alter or contest its terms. I asked her what the word intact was carrying in that sentence. Meg set down her coffee cup. She looked at me the way she looks at clients when she is about to say something they need to hear clearly. "The trust is solid," she said. "But there is one circumstance under Tennessee law where it becomes vulnerable. If a court were to determine that you lack the cognitive capacity to manage your own affairs, if someone were to file a guardianship petition and a judge were to grant it, then the appointed guardian would have standing to petition for modification of the trust terms. It would not be automatic. It would be a fight. But it would be a fight that could happen." She let that sit for a moment before continuing. "A guardianship petition," she explained, "is a legal filing that asks a court to declare an individual unable to make sound decisions for themselves and to appoint another person a guardian to act in their place. In Tennessee, such petitions require supporting documentation, typically including a professional evaluation of the subject's mental and cognitive state. The process has legitimate and important uses. It also, Meg said carefully, has a history of being misused in cases involving elderly individuals with substantial assets. The filing party would need to demonstrate cause. They would need documentation. They would need, in most cases, a medical or psychiatric professional willing to provide an assessment supporting their claim. I looked at Meg across the desk. So they need a doctor, I said. It was not a question. I had understood the shape of this the moment she began explaining the guardianship pathway. Everything she had described, the petition, the evaluation, the pathway to challenging the trust, required one foundational element before any of it could move forward. Someone with credentials and a willingness to provide a professional opinion that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. Meg held my gaze. Yes, she said, that's exactly what they need. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, West End Avenue was beginning to fill with the Monday morning sounds of a city waking up traffic building, the distant horn of a delivery truck, the particular rhythm of Nashville pulling itself into the week. I have always found that sound grounding. Thomas used to say the city had a pulse you could feel if you sat still long enough. I sat still. How long would a petition process take? I asked. From filing to preliminary hearing, under current court schedules, typically between 3 and 6 weeks. If someone were already in conversation with an evaluator, if the groundwork had been laid before the filing, they could move quickly. And the trust modification, if the petition were granted, additional proceedings. But the damage would begin at the petition stage. A granted guardianship puts a cloud over everything your ability to make legal decisions, to direct your own affairs, to be taken seriously in any subsequent legal challenge. She paused. It is designed to be difficult to reverse once it is in place. I thought about the men on the terrace, the 60-day window, the financial institution that had already cleared things at their end. I thought about 8 months of videos and a woman who had been inside my home with a camera and a plan. Someone had been preparing for a long time, and they were further along than I had realized. All right, I said. I picked up my coffee. Then we need to be further along than they are. Meg reached for her legal pad. That, she said, is exactly why I pulled the files this weekend. The file arrived on a Tuesday morning, just after 8 o'clock. It came by email, from an address I did not immediately recognize, a string of initials and numbers that gave nothing away. The subject line contained a single word: appointments. No greeting, no explanation. Just a plain document attached, 3 pages long, formatted like a calendar printout with names, dates, and locations listed in neat columns. I almost did not open it. I am careful about unsolicited messages, as anyone who has spent decades in the legal system learns to be. But something about the timing a week after my conversation with Meg, in the middle of a situation that was becoming less theoretical by the day, made me pause before deleting it. I opened the attachment. It was a record of my daughter-in-law Sloane's appointments over the previous 3 weeks. 18 entries in total, a hair appointment on a Wednesday, a lunch meeting at a restaurant in Green Hills, a showing at a property on Granny White Pike, a consultation at a financial planning office downtown, and, listed third from the bottom of the second page, a name I had not seen in 15 years, Dr. Raymond Holt, psychiatrist, private practice, Belle Mead. I read the name twice. Then I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the kitchen counter, the way you set something down when your hands need a moment to remember what steady feels like. Within the hour, I had a visitor. She came to the back door, knocked twice, quietly, the way someone knocks when they are not entirely sure of their welcome but have decided to come anyway. When I opened it, I found a 17-year-old girl standing on the back step with a canvas backpack over one shoulder and an expression of careful composure that reminded me, in a way I was not prepared for, of myself at that age. Her name was Lily Ashford. She was the daughter of Daniel's first cousin on his father's side, a connection that placed her at the outer edge of the family, but close enough to have been present at dinners, holidays, and the kind of informal gatherings where people say more than they intend to. She was a junior at a private school in Brentwood, an honor student with a stated interest in law, and she had been, as she explained to me in the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment, paying attention to Sloane Whitfield for approximately 6 months. I sent you the file, she said, before I could ask. I stepped back and let her in. We sat at the kitchen table. Lily unzipped her backpack and produced a second copy of the document she had emailed printed, organized with small sticky tabs marking different sections, and placed it on the table between us. She explained that she had been tracking Sloane's schedule through a combination of sources: a shared family calendar that Sloane had never removed her from, an online booking platform Sloane used for professional appointments that displayed confirmed bookings without requiring a login, and her own direct observation during family events. She said it matter-of-factly, without apology, in the tone of someone who has done a careful thing and knows it. "Why?" I asked her. She looked at me steadily. "Because something felt wrong, and nobody else was looking." I thought about that for a moment, then I looked back down at the name on the second page. Raymond Holt had been a practicing psychiatrist in Nashville for 20 years before I encountered him in my courtroom. He had built a reputation as a specialist in competency evaluations assessments of whether an individual possessed the mental and cognitive capacity to manage their own affairs, make legal decisions, or stand trial. It was precise, specialized work, and he had been, by all accounts, competent at it for most of his career. What ended that career was a case that came before my bench 15 years ago, a family dispute over a substantial estate in which an elderly woman had been declared incompetent on the basis of a psychiatric evaluation Holt had provided. The declaration had allowed her son to assume control of her assets. It had been, on the surface, a clean piece of legal work. What I found, over the course of that proceeding, was that it was not clean at all. Holt had provided testimony that was inconsistent with his own clinical notes. His evaluation had omitted findings that contradicted his conclusion. When I examined the record in full, what emerged was not an honest professional assessment, but a document constructed to reach a predetermined outcome, one that benefited the party who had retained him. I revoked his license to provide expert testimony in Tennessee courts. The state medical board followed with their own action shortly after, suspending his clinical license pending review. The review had not gone in his favor. Raymond Holt had not been a licensed practicing psychiatrist for 15 years, and yet his name was on Sloane's appointment calendar. I looked up at Lily, who was watching me with that careful, patient expression. "Do you know what he does now?" I asked. "Private consultations," she said. "He is not listed with the state medical board as an active provider, but he still meets with clients." I found 3 references to him in online forums for estate planning people, describing him as someone who could provide documentation for a fee. Documentation. The word sat between us on the table like something that had been placed there deliberately. I thought about Meg's explanation of the guardianship pathway. I thought about what that pathway required: a professional evaluation, signed by someone with credentials, stating that the subject lacked the capacity to manage her own affairs. I thought about a man who had lost his license in my courtroom and had apparently spent the intervening years finding other ways to provide the same service. Sloane had found him. She did not know, I was quite certain, who had signed the order that ended his career. I asked Lily to leave her copy of the document. She did, without hesitation. I told her she had done something that required both courage and patience, and that I would be in touch. She nodded, picked up her backpack, and let herself out the back door the same way she had come in. I waited until I heard the latch click. Then I picked up my phone and called Meg. "I know the doctor they hired," I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not a long one. Meg has known me for 25 years, and she has learned, in that time, that when I say something in that particular tone of voice, the details that follow are going to matter. "Of course you do," she said. The doorbell rang at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Not the back door this time, the front, which told me she had thought about it. Coming to the front door is a different kind of statement than coming to the back. It means you are not slipping in quietly. It means you have decided to arrive. I opened the door and found Lily standing on the front step in the late afternoon light, a different bag over her shoulder, this time larger, structured, the kind that holds more than a day's worth of anything. She was wearing her school uniform still, which meant she had come directly from Brentwood without stopping at home first. She looked composed, the way she had looked the day before, but there was something additional in her expression now, a kind of readiness. "I have more," she said. I stepped back and let her in. She followed me to the kitchen table, the same place we had sat the previous morning, and this time she did not simply produce one document. She unzipped her bag and began placing items on the table with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to do exactly this. I watched her work and did not rush her. The first item was a printed folder, an inch thick, held together with a binder clip. Inside, as she explained, were 6 months of correspondence emails exchanged between Sloan and a real estate development company called Pinnacle Group, a firm based out of Franklin that specialized, according to their own materials, in acquiring and redeveloping historic properties across Middle Tennessee. Lily had accessed the emails through a cloud-based account Sloan had logged into on a shared family computer during a gathering at Daniel's cousin's house 4 months ago, and had never logged out of. Lily had not gone looking for them. She had simply noticed the account was open, recognized Sloan's name, and made a decision. The emails, she said, went back to shortly after Daniel and Sloan's wedding. The second item was a small recording device, the kind that looks like an ordinary pen, sold at any electronics store, and 3 separate audio files she had transferred to a USB drive. The recordings had been made during phone calls Sloan conducted at the family home on occasions when she believed she was alone. Lily had been present on each occasion, doing homework in an adjacent room, and had pressed record when she recognized the tone of the conversations. She described the tone the same way I would have described it: low, clipped, the register a person uses when they are discussing something they do not want overheard. The third item was a handwritten notebook, spiral-bound, filled with neat entries in blue ink, dates, times, observations. Every occasion over the past 6 months when Sloan had entered Whitfield House during a period when Caroline was not present, the length of each visit, who, if anyone, accompanied her, what, if anything, Lily had observed being carried in or out. The entries were precise and consistent, written in the kind of shorthand that suggested Lily had developed her own system for this work over time. I looked at everything spread across my kitchen table. Then I looked at the girl who had put it there. Lily Ashford was 17 years old. She was the daughter of a cousin, a peripheral figure at family events, the kind of young person that adults tend to overlook because they are neither central enough to require attention nor disruptive enough to demand it. She had used that invisibility the way the best observers always do, not to disappear, but to see. I thought about what it had taken to do what she had done. Not just the technical patience of it, the months of quiet documentation, the careful handling of information that could have been dismissed or disbelieved if presented carelessly. I thought about the particular courage it requires to decide, at 17, that something is wrong and that you are the one who is going to do something about it, not because anyone asked you to, not because it was safe or simple, but because your conscience left you no other choice. Walk me through the Pinnacle correspondence, I said. Start at the beginning. She did. She was thorough and clear, moving through the material in chronological order, flagging the emails she considered most significant, and explaining the context for each one. The picture that emerged was of a relationship between Sloan and Pinnacle Group that had begun within weeks of her marriage to Daniel, a series of exploratory conversations that had gradually become something more structured, more committed, more specifically focused on a single property at a specific address. My address. By the time Lily finished, the afternoon light had shifted and the kitchen had gone quiet around us in the way it does in the early evening, when the neighborhood settles and the birds stop and the day begins its transition into something else. I sat with what she had shown me for a long moment. Then I looked across the table at this 17-year-old girl who had spent 6 months doing what trained investigators do, without training, without resources, without anyone telling her it mattered. "How long have you been watching?" I asked. She met my eyes without hesitation. 6 months. I nodded slowly. Outside, the last of the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor the way it does in October, long and angled and particular to this latitude, this season, this house. "Good girl," I said. Meg arrived at 7 in the morning with her reading glasses and a fresh legal pad. She had not been in my kitchen before. Our meetings had always been at her office, on her territory, surrounded by her files. But this was different. This was not a consultation. This was something closer to what I used to call, in my years on the bench, a case review, the kind of session where you spread everything out on a flat surface and look at it all together until the shape of it becomes clear. Lily came at 8, still in her coat, having stopped on her way to school to drop off 2 additional printouts she had prepared the night before. She could not stay. She had a calculus examination at 9, but she sat with us for 20 minutes, walked Meg through the organization of the documents, answered 3 questions with the precision of someone twice her age, and left with the quiet confidence of someone who knows they have done their part. Meg watched her go, Where did she come from? She said. The same place good lawyers come from, I said. She started paying attention before anyone told her to. We worked through the morning. Meg took the lead on the financial documents. She has a facility with numbers that I have always admired while I focused on the correspondence, reading each email in sequence and building a timeline in my head the way I used to build timelines in complex litigation. By 10 o'clock, the picture that had been forming in pieces over the past week had finally resolved itself into something complete. The first thread Meg pulled concerned a name that appeared repeatedly in the financial records Lily had compiled, Marcus Webb. He was not identified by title in the documents themselves, but cross-referencing his name with a business filing Lily had included in the back of the folder identified him as the principal of a private lending company registered in Williamson County. The nature of his relationship with Sloan became clear through a series of wire transfer records and a loan agreement, not the original, but a modification document that referenced the original terms. Sloan had borrowed $340,000 from Marcus Webb. The loan had been taken out approximately 14 months ago, before her marriage to Daniel, and it had been structured with a repayment timeline that Meg, reading the modification document, identified immediately as unusual. The interest terms were not punishing in the conventional sense. What was unusual was the balloon clause, a provision requiring full repayment of the outstanding principal within a specific window, triggered by a condition that had apparently been met. The window, according to the modification document Lily had obtained, was 60 days from the trigger date. That date had passed 3 weeks ago. She is already in default, Meg said, not looking up from the page. The second thread concerned Pinnacle Group directly. Among Lily's documents was a contract, not a letter of intent, not a preliminary agreement, but a signed acquisition contract between Sloan Whitfield and Pinnacle Group, dated 11 days after Sloan and Daniel's wedding. The contract specified the property at our Whitfield House address. It outlined a purchase price consistent with current market assessments for historic properties in our area of Nashville. And it contained a performance clause that Meg read aloud to me in the even, careful tone she uses when she wants to make sure a thing lands correctly. If the property was not transferred to Pinnacle Group's ownership within 90 days of the contract date, Sloan would be liable for a penalty payment of $500,000. Meg set the document down. I looked at the wedding date. I looked at the contract date. 11 days apart. I thought about the vineyard outside Franklin where Daniel and Sloan had married. I thought about the ceremony, the photographs, the way Sloan had smiled at my son at the altar with that composed, practiced warmth. I thought about the reception dinner, the toasts, the moment at the end of the evening when Daniel had looked across the room at me with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that I had felt, in spite of everything I was only now beginning to understand, genuinely glad for him. 11 days later, she had signed a contract to sell his mother's home. The timeline was not a coincidence. It was a sequence. She had married Daniel because she needed his name, his proximity, his presence in this household to make her plan credible. She had needed access to the property, to family events, to the kind of casual domestic familiarity that would allow her to document, to film, to prepare the groundwork for a legal proceeding without raising suspicion. The marriage had given her all of that, and it had given her a clock. 90 days on the Pinnacle contract, 60 days on the Webb repayment. The two timelines overlapped in a way that told me she needed the house sale to close before the debt came due. She had structured her entire financial position around a property she did not own, using a legal mechanism she had not yet secured, against a woman she had apparently decided would not be paying close enough attention. Meg refilled her coffee. The kitchen was quiet. She married my son to buy herself 60 days, I said. It was not a question. There was no uncertainty in it, no residual disbelief that needed to be worked through out loud. It was simply the thing that was true, stated in the plainest available terms, because that is what you do when you have looked at the evidence long enough and carefully enough that the conclusion is no longer a theory. It is just the shape of what happened. Meg looked at me over the rim of her cup. She did not offer comfort or outrage. She knew me well enough to know I did not need either. Then we have 57 days left, she said. What do you want to do with them? The week between Thursday and Sunday gave me time to think. Not about the documents, those I had already turned over in my mind until their edges were smooth and familiar, the way a stone becomes when you carry it long enough. What I thought about, in the quieter hours of that week, was my son. The boy who used to build things out of whatever he could find, blocks, cardboard, the wooden spools from my sewing kit, and line them up along the hallway floor with such care that you had to step over them rather than disturb his work. The boy who became a man who designs buildings for a living, who chose a profession that is entirely about making things that hold. Thomas used to say Daniel got that from him. I always thought Daniel came to it on his own. He arrived at 6 o'clock on Sunday evening, exactly on time, the way he has always arrived, punctual in the manner of someone who considers it a form of respect. He was wearing a collared shirt and dark trousers, his coat folded over one arm, his hair combed in the way that tells me he made an effort. Daniel is 39 years old, lean and quiet-faced like his father, with Thomas's same habit of looking at a room before he enters it fully, as though he is checking the load-bearing capacity before he commits his weight. He was tired. Not the surface tiredness of a long week, something deeper, the kind that settles into the set of a person's shoulders and the way they hold their jaw. A mother notices these things. We are trained by years of practice to read the body of a child we carried, and we do not lose that fluency simply because they grow up and move out and start lives we are no longer at the center of. Sloane was not with him. He said she had a prior commitment, a word he used without elaboration, and I did not ask for any. I had made pot roast, his favorite since he was 7 years old, carrots, potatoes, a low and slow braise that had been in the oven since noon and had filled the house with the kind of smell that makes a place feel like home, even when home is complicated. I had set the table in the dining room rather than the kitchen, the good china, the cloth napkins, the candles, because some occasions deserve that kind of deliberateness, even when nothing of consequence is being said out loud. We talked through dinner the way we always do when it is just the two of us easily, with the particular comfort of people who have known each other long enough that silence is not uncomfortable. He told me about a project he had been working on for the past several months, a community arts center commissioned by a nonprofit in East Nashville, modest in scale but technically interesting, a renovation of a building that had been a textile warehouse in the 1940s. He talked about the structural challenges with the kind of quiet enthusiasm that reminds me of Thomas explaining a problem at the dinner table, not performing excitement, simply sharing something that genuinely interested him. I listened. I asked questions. I let the evening be what it was on the surface, a mother and her son having dinner on a Sunday, because that was what he needed it to be, and because I have learned, over a long career of waiting for the right moment, that patience is not the absence of intention. It is intention held still until the conditions are right. We had finished eating and I had poured coffee when I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. He looked up. I have known this face for 39 years. I knew it before it had any expression other than hunger and sleep. I watched it learn to smile, to concentrate, to grieve when Thomas passed. I have read it through every season of his life, and I have always been able to find, somewhere in it, the boy who lined things up carefully in the hallway and did not want anyone to knock them over. I found him now, somewhere behind the tired eyes and the careful composure. "Are you happy, Daniel?" I asked. It was the only question I had any right to ask that evening. Not about the documents, not about the contract, not about the things I knew and the timeline that was running and the choices that were being made in his name by someone he had trusted. Just that one question, the most honest one available, the one that cuts through everything else because it cannot be answered with information or explanation. He did not answer right away. He looked down at the table. His hand stayed still under mine. Outside, the October evening had gone fully dark, and the neighborhood was quiet, and the house held the particular stillness it holds on Sunday nights when the week ahead has not yet begun its noise. Then he looked up. "I don't know, Mom," he said. 3 words, spoken quietly, without drama, in the voice of a man who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that he no longer remembers what it felt like to set it down. I did not push. I did not follow it with the next question or the one after that. I simply kept my hand over his for a moment longer, and then I took it back, and I refilled his coffee, and we sat together in the way that people sit when something true has been said, and there is nothing left to add to it. He left at 8:30. I walked him to the door and watched him go down the front path to his car, the way I used to watch him walk to the school bus when he was small, that same feeling of him moving away from me into a world I could not entirely protect him from. I went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a while. That was the most honest thing my son had said to me in 2 years. Not a confession, not a cry for help. Just the plain truth of a man who had begun, somewhere in the quiet of his own life, to ask himself the question he had not yet found the answer to. He was not lost. Not entirely. And that was the only thing I needed to know. The message arrived Monday evening, while I was reading in the sitting room. It was from Sloane, cheerful, brief, the kind of message designed to sound spontaneous even when it is not. She asked if I would be up for tea the following afternoon. She said she would love to film a little for her channel, something warm and relaxed, just the two of us. She added a small heart at the end, which is a habit of hers I have observed across many messages and have never once taken at face value. I waited 20 minutes before responding. Not because I needed to think about it, I had known this invitation was coming in some form since I watched her 47 videos and understood the direction she was building toward. I waited because a woman who agrees too quickly seems eager, and I have never found eagerness useful in any negotiation. Then I wrote back, "That sounds lovely. See you tomorrow." She arrived at 2 o'clock Tuesday afternoon with a camera mounted on a small tripod, a ring light that she set up near the sitting room window, and a tote bag that held, among other things, a selection of herbal teas she had brought herself rather than using what was already in my kitchen. I noticed that. She wanted control of the props. Sloane Whitfield in person is exactly what her videos suggest composed, warm in a way that is technically indistinguishable from genuine warmth, and precise about the details of her own presentation in the way that people are precise when appearance is a professional tool rather than a personal one. She is attractive and she knows it, and she uses it the way she uses everything else efficiently, without waste. She greeted me with a hug that lasted exactly the right amount of time, complimented the sitting room light, and began arranging the space with the practiced ease of someone who has done this hundreds of times. She directed me to the armchair near the window. I sat where I was told. I was wearing a pale blue cardigan, soft, slightly worn at the cuffs, the kind of garment that reads, on camera, as gentle and domestic. I had chosen it deliberately. I had also worn my hair down rather than pinned, and I had left my reading glasses on the side table within frame. Every detail I presented that afternoon was a choice, and none of those choices were made to flatter myself. When she pressed the button to begin recording and the small indicator light went red, Sloane became a version of herself I recognized from every video in her series, softer voiced, slower in her gestures, tilted slightly toward the camera with the easy intimacy of someone speaking to a trusted friend rather than an audience. She introduced me as her mother-in-law, described the sitting room as one of her favorite places in Nashville, and said, with evident affection, that spending time here always reminded her of what truly mattered. I smiled. I poured the tea she had brought. I answered her questions in the unhurried cadence of a woman with nowhere pressing to be. She asked about my routine. I described it simply. She asked what I found most challenging about living alone. I said some days the quiet takes getting used to, which is true and sounds, in the right framing, like exactly the kind of admission she needed. She nodded with practiced sympathy and told her audience that this was why families showed up for each other. I kept smiling. I kept my hands relaxed in my lap. I let her build the picture she had come to build. For 38 minutes, I was exactly what she needed me to be. It was in the 39th minute that she made her mistakes. Not large ones, she was too careful for large ones. But I have spent 4 decades listening to people speak under conditions where they believed they were in control of the room, and I have learned that the small mistakes are the ones that matter. Large errors can be explained away. Small ones are the truth leaking through the seams. The first came when a notification appeared on her phone, which she had set face up on the side table. She glanced at it a reflex, not a decision, and said, smoothly enough, that she was just waiting on a confirmation from the Pinnacle Group regarding a property matter. She said it the way people say things when they have said them so many times internally that they forget the words have not yet been spoken out loud. Then she moved on, quickly, to a question about the garden. I did not react. I kept my expression at the same mild, pleasant register it had been all afternoon. The second came 10 minutes later, when she was describing, for her audience, the general situation of families navigating what she called a transition plan for aging parents. She used the phrase with the ease of someone who had rehearsed it many times. She did not say my name. She did not need to. The camera was pointed at both of us. The third came near the end, when she was wrapping up with the kind of warm, summarizing remarks she uses to close her recordings. She said that these things take time, that patience was important, and that she was looking forward to how everything would come together once everything is settled. She smiled at the camera when she said it. Then she smiled at me. I smiled back. When she packed up her equipment and said goodbye with another precisely timed hug, I walked her to the door and stood on the front step and watched her car until it turned at the end of the street. Then I went back inside, opened my laptop, and pulled up the recording software I had installed on the small device Lily had left with me 3 days earlier, positioned on the bookshelf behind the armchair, indistinguishable from the row of small framed photographs it sat among. 40 minutes. Every word, every name, every phrase. Sloane had come to my home that afternoon believing she was filming a cooperative old woman in a blue cardigan. She had arranged the light and chosen the chair and controlled the props and managed the conversation with considerable skill. What she had not accounted for was the woman sitting in the chair. She thought she was recording me. She had no idea I was recording her. I did not know what was happening on the other side of town that Saturday morning. I was in the back garden, cutting the last of the autumn roses before the first hard frost came and made the decision for me, when the events that would change the shape of everything were unfolding in a house on Hillsborough Road, without my knowledge and without my presence. I learned what happened later, in pieces, the way you learn things that were witnessed by someone else through the account of a person who was there, who went back over it carefully because he needed to understand it as much as I needed to hear it. This is what Daniel told me. Sloane had left that morning for a client appointment on the east side of the city. She had mentioned it the night before, a showing, she said, something that would take most of the morning. Daniel had stayed home. He had a set of architectural drawings spread across the dining room table that needed his attention, and he had been looking forward to the particular quiet of a Saturday morning alone with work he cared about. He went to Sloane's desk around 10 o'clock to find an insurance document. Not anything significant, a renewal notice he thought he had seen her set there earlier in the week, something to do with the home policy. Her desk sat in the small room off the main hallway that she used as an office, neat and well organized in the manner she kept all her spaces. He sat down and opened the first drawer. The insurance document was not there. He tried the second drawer. Then he noticed her laptop open on the desk, the screen still active from earlier that morning. He was not looking for anything. That is the part I want to be clear about, because it matters to what came next. Daniel did not sit down at that desk with suspicion in his mind. He sat down looking for a routine piece of paper, and what he found instead was a folder on his wife's desktop that had not been there the last time he used her computer to print something 3 weeks before. It was labeled with 4 letters and a set of numbers that meant nothing to him at first glance. But below the main label, in smaller text, was a subtitle she had added 2 words that stopped him entirely. WH Project Timeline. He told me he sat there for a moment before he opened it, the way you pause before opening a door when something about the quality of the silence on the other side does not feel right. Then he clicked. Inside were 7 documents. He opened them in order. The first was a contract formal, multi-page, bearing the header of Pinnacle Group at the top, and at the bottom of the final page, his wife's signature beside a notary stamp. The property address listed on the first page was the address he had grown up coming to for Sunday dinners, the address his father had built a house at 30 years ago, the address where his mother still kept the ceramic bowl he had made in a pottery class when he was 9 years old. He read the contract through twice. The second document was a chain of emails printed and scanned, which told him they had been prepared for presentation rather than simply stored. The correspondence was between Sloane and a man identified as Dr. Raymond Holt, and it concerned what the emails referred to as a scheduled evaluation. The language was clinical and careful in the way that language is careful when the people using it understand it may one day be read by someone other than the intended recipient. The subject of the evaluation was not named directly in most of the messages, but the property address appeared twice, and in one email, toward the end of the chain, Dr. Holt had written, "Confirm subject availability for in-home assessment, 3rd week of month." Daniel knew what an in-home cognitive assessment was. He was the son of a federal judge and the husband of a woman who had been researching guardianship law for, as he could now see, considerably longer than he had known. The third document was a timeline, 90 days broken into 3 columns: preparation, filing, and closing. Each column contained specific tasks, dates, and the names of individuals responsible for completing them. The final column, the one headed with the words projected closing date, contained a date that was, by Daniel's count that Saturday morning, 31 days away. He sat at his wife's desk, and he read every page. He told me he did not feel what he expected to feel. He had expected, if he ever found something like this, if such a thing had ever existed, to find that he would feel rage or shock or the particular vertigo of a world rearranging itself beneath your feet. What he felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. A recognition, the sensation of something that had been half known for a long time finally stepping fully into the light. When he finished reading, he closed the laptop. He straightened the documents on the desk the way his father used to straighten things out of habit, out of the small dignities you maintain even when everything around you is coming undone. He stood up. He put on his coat. He picked up his keys from the hook by the front door. He drove across town without calling ahead. He told me later that he had needed the drive to find the right words, and that by the time he pulled into my street, he still had not found them. So he did what he had done as a boy. When the words would not come, he came to where I was, and trusted that the words would arrive when he needed them. He came to the back door. 3 quiet knocks. I had just come in from the garden, my hands still cool from the morning air, a handful of rose stems lying on the kitchen counter. I heard the knock and I knew, before I opened the door, that the shape of things was about to change. I opened it. Daniel stood on the back step, his face carrying the expression of a man who has just finished reading something he cannot unread. I stepped aside. He came in. He looked the way people look when the ground has shifted, and they have not yet decided whether to trust their own footing. I stepped back from the door without a word and he came inside, moving through the kitchen the way he used to move through this house, as a boy with the automatic familiarity of someone who has known a space long enough that his body remembers it, even when his mind is elsewhere. He set his laptop on the kitchen table. He did not take off his coat. I put the kettle on, not because either of us particularly needed coffee at that moment, but because having something to do with your hands is a mercy in certain kinds of conversations, and I have learned over a long life that the small rituals, the kettle, the cups, the ordinary choreography of an ordinary kitchen create enough structure around a hard thing to make it bearable. He sat down at the table. I kept my back to him for a moment, measuring coffee into the press, listening to the particular quality of his silence. There are different kinds of silence. I have sat through hundreds of them in courtrooms, in conference rooms, in hospital waiting areas. The silence Daniel was sitting in that evening was the kind that comes after a person has finished processing something and arrived at the other side of it, not numb, not shattered, but very, very still. When I turned around, he had opened the laptop. The folder was there on the screen, the contents arranged in the same order he had found them that morning. He looked at it, and then he looked at me. And what passed across his face in that moment was not the question I had expected. It was not anger, or grief, or the particular wound of betrayal. It was something more careful than any of those things. He was reading my face the way I had spent his entire life reading his. "You already knew," he said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation precise and quiet, in the tone of a man who has just understood that the conversation he thought he was about to begin had, in fact, started some time ago without him. I brought the cups to the table and sat down across from him. "Yes," I said. He absorbed that for a moment. Outside, the October evening had deepened into the kind of full dark that comes early in autumn, and the kitchen was warm and close around us in the way it gets when the outdoor temperature drops and the windows hold the interior light. "How long?" he asked. I thought about the gala, the 2 men on the terrace, the drive home along the highway with the lights of Nashville behind me, and the first clear shape of what I had heard beginning to form. I thought about the Saturday morning in Thomas's study, and the laptop opened in the sitting room, and the 47 videos, and Meg across the desk with the trust documents spread between us, and Lily at the front door with a bag full of 6 months of careful work. "Long enough," I said. "Long enough to be sure." He looked down at the table. His hands were resting on either side of the laptop, flat against the wood, and I noticed that they were very still, the hands of a man who is using stillness the way I use it, as a form of control. I waited. I have always known how to wait. What came next was the part that I had not permitted myself to anticipate, because anticipating things that matter to you is a way of setting yourself up to be wrong, and I had learned long ago that it is better to let the people you love arrive at their own conclusions in their own time. He raised his head. His eyes were clear. Not dry, there was something in them that was not far from tears, but clear in the way that matters. The way that means a person is present and thinking and has not retreated from the difficulty of the moment into something easier. I should have seen it, he said. I should have been paying attention. You were living your life, I said. That is not the same thing as not paying attention. It is just a different kind of looking. He shook his head slowly, the way he used to shake it as a boy when he had made an error in his schoolwork and could not forgive himself for it quickly enough. Thomas used to tell him that the measure of a person is not whether they make mistakes. It is what they do once they have seen them clearly. I did not say that now. It was not the right moment for it, but I thought it. The coffee had been sitting between us untouched. He reached for his cup, wrapped both hands around it the way you wrap your hands around something warm, when the warmth is itself a comfort. Sat with it for a long moment. Then he set it down and looked at me directly, the full, open look of a man who has decided to stop managing the distance between himself and the truth of a situation. "What do you need from me?" he asked. 4 words. Simple and direct. The way the most important questions usually are once a person has cleared away everything that was standing between themselves and the asking of them. I had spent weeks building something careful and patient and precise, gathering evidence, consulting Meg, watching and waiting, and holding my knowledge close while the situation developed around me. I had done it because it needed to be done that way, and because no one else was going to do it. But I had done it alone. And there is a weight to doing important things alone that you do not fully feel until someone sits across from you and offers to share it. I looked at my son. "I need you to trust me," I said, "and I need you to follow my lead. Can you do that?" He held my gaze without flinching. "Yes," he said. That was the right answer, and it was the first time in 2 years that he had asked the right question before giving it. The filing arrived on a Monday morning. Meg called me at 7:45, before I had finished my first cup of coffee, and read me the summary in the measured tone she uses when she wants to convey information without conveying alarm. A petition for cognitive capacity evaluation had been submitted to Davidson County Probate Court late the previous Friday, citing concerns about my ability to manage my personal and financial affairs. The petitioner was listed as a third-party medical professional acting on behalf of a concerned family member. The evaluating physician named in the document was Dr. Raymond Holt. I listened to the full summary without interrupting. When Meg finished, there was a brief silence. "They moved faster than I expected," I said. "They are running out of time," Meg said, "which means they are getting nervous. Nervous people make mistakes." She was right. And the mistake they had made, the central, irreversible mistake at the heart of this entire filing, was the name at the bottom of the petition. Because Raymond Holt, whatever else he was a man whose professional history existed in the public record of Davidson County. And the judge who had signed the disciplinary order that ended his career in this jurisdiction was not a stranger. She was the woman named as the subject of his evaluation. We had been preparing for this since the morning. Lily first placed his name on my kitchen table. In the 10 days since Daniel had come to me with the laptop and the folder and the question that mattered, we had moved with the deliberate efficiency of people who understand that preparation is the only form of certainty available to them. Meg had assembled the counter-filing. I had undergone full cognitive assessments with 3 independent physicians, not because I doubted my own faculties, but because doubt is a tool, and I had no intention of leaving anyone a tool they could use against me. The assessments had been thorough. All 3 physicians were board-certified, currently licensed, and entirely unconnected to any party in the proceeding. All 3 had submitted written findings that were, in Meg's words, unambiguous. I was, by every clinical measure available to the state of Tennessee, a woman in full possession of her cognitive and legal capacity. The hearing was scheduled for that same Monday afternoon at 2 o'clock in a third-floor courtroom of the Davidson County Courthouse on 2nd Avenue North. I had been inside that building more times than I could count as a young attorney, as a witness, as a judge in the years before I moved to the federal bench. I knew the particular sound of its hallways and the particular quality of its light in the late afternoon when it comes through the west-facing windows at a low angle and turns the marble floors the color of old honey. I dressed carefully that morning. A charcoal wool jacket, pressed, dark trousers. The small pearl earrings Thomas had given me on our 20th anniversary, which I wear when I need to remind myself that I am not only a professional but a person with a history worth defending. Meg met me in the lobby. She was carrying a document case I had not seen before, larger than her usual, with a combination lock on the clasp. "Is all of it in there?" I asked. "All of it," she said. "His original license suspension order, the state medical board's subsequent findings, the civil judgment from the estate case that preceded your disciplinary ruling, 3 letters of objection from the Tennessee Association of Forensic Evaluators, and your 3 independent assessments, tabbed and indexed." I nodded. We went upstairs. The courtroom was smaller than the ones I had presided over, a standard probate hearing room, wood-paneled, with a raised bench and 2 counsel tables facing it, and a gallery of perhaps 20 seats, most of them empty on a Monday afternoon. A clerk was arranging papers at the bench. A court reporter was setting up her equipment near the side wall. Raymond Holt was already in the room. He was standing near the far counsel table with a man I did not recognize, his attorney, presumably, and he was looking down at a folder in his hands with the focused expression of someone reviewing their notes. He had aged in the 15 years since I had last seen him across a courtroom. His hair had gone fully white, and he carried himself with the particular careful posture of a man who has learned to take up less space than he used to. He looked up when we entered. I have seen many things register on a person's face in a courtroom: surprise, recognition, the particular recalibration that happens when a situation turns out to be different from what was anticipated. What crossed Raymond Holt's face in the moment he saw me walk through that door was something more specific than any of those things. It was the expression of a man who has, in a single instant, understood the full dimensions of what he has walked into. The color left his face in a way that was visible from across the room. I looked at him for exactly as long as it takes to let a person know they have been seen. Then I looked away, set my bag on our counsel table, and sat down. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Meg presented our response with the unhurried precision of someone who has prepared so thoroughly that the outcome was settled before the first page was read. The 3 independent assessments were entered into the record. The history of Dr. Holt's professional standing in Tennessee was entered into the record. The presiding judge, a woman I knew by reputation, careful and fair, appointed to probate court 6 years prior, reviewed the counterfiling without visible expression. She denied the petition. The language she used was measured and complete. The evaluation instrument was inadmissible, having been prepared by an individual whose standing to provide expert testimony in Tennessee courts had been formally revoked. The supporting documentation did not meet the evidentiary standard required for the proceeding. The petition was dismissed without prejudice, which meant it could theoretically be refiled, but only by someone who had not just watched their primary instrument walk out of a courtroom in the condition Raymond Holt was walking out in. He left without speaking to anyone. He did not look at Meg. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at me. I waited until the room had cleared. Then I stood, buttoned the top button of my jacket, picked up my bag, and walked out into the marble hallway where the late afternoon light was doing exactly what I remembered it doing, turning everything it touched, the color of something that had been here a long time and intended to remain. 2 days after the hearing, I made a phone call I had been thinking about for longer than I had admitted to myself. The name James Okafor had come to my attention 6 weeks earlier through a profile piece in the Nashville scene that Lily had printed and left in the folder she brought to my kitchen table. He was an investigative journalist at a local television station, a man in his mid-40s who had spent the better part of a decade covering stories that other reporters tended to find too slow, too complicated, or too unglamorous to pursue. Elder financial abuse was one of his areas of sustained focus. In the past 2 years, he had produced 3 long-form reports on the subject, cases involving forged documents, manipulated legal proceedings, and family members who had used the machinery of caregiving as a method of asset extraction. He understood the architecture of what had been done to me. He had seen it before, in different configurations, with different names. That was why I called him. I reached him on his direct line at the station. I introduced myself by name and told him I had a story he might find worth his time. I did not elaborate. In my experience, elaborating too early is a way of giving someone the opportunity to say no before they have understood what they are saying no to. I simply asked if he would be willing to meet, and I gave him enough of an outline to understand that this was not a complaint or a grievance, but a documented case with a paper trail. He said he could meet Wednesday morning. We met at a small coffee shop on Charlotte Avenue, in the part of West Nashville where the older bungalow neighborhoods give way to a stretch of independent businesses that have held their ground against the relentless tide of development the city has been riding for the past decade. It was the kind of place with mismatched chairs and coffee that was better than it needed to be, where the ambient noise provided enough cover for a private conversation without requiring either of us to raise our voices. James Okafor arrived 2 minutes before me, which told me something. A journalist who arrives early to a source meeting is one who has already decided the story is worth his attention before he has heard it in full. He was tall, composed, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has trained himself to listen more than he speaks. He stood when I came in, which I noted. He offered his hand, which I took. We ordered coffee. I set my bag on the chair beside me and I looked at him for a moment before I opened it. "I want to be clear about something before we begin," I said. "I am not here because I need help. I am here because what was attempted against me is not unique to me, and the people who attempt these things rely on the assumption that their subjects will be too confused or too frightened or too proud to speak about it publicly. I am none of those things. What I am is thorough, and I would like what I have documented to be useful beyond my own situation." He held my gaze. "I understand," he said. I opened my bag. The first thing I placed on the table was a USB drive containing 47 videos, the complete archive of the online series my daughter-in-law had built over 8 months, filmed inside my home, describing me to an audience of millions as a woman in diminishing capacity. I placed it without comment and let it sit. The second item was a printed transcript of the audio recording from my sitting room, the session Lily's device had captured during the afternoon my daughter-in-law had come to film. The relevant passages were highlighted. The reference to Pinnacle Group, the phrase about a transition plan, the comment about things being settled. The third was a copy of the signed acquisition contract between my daughter-in-law and Pinnacle Group, with the date circled 11 days after her wedding to my son. The fourth was the complete disciplinary record of Raymond Holt, including the order I had signed 15 years ago and the state medical board's subsequent findings, alongside the petition he had filed and the Monday dismissal from Davidson County Probate Court. The fifth was a 2-page financial summary. Meg had prepared the debt structure, the lending arrangement, the penalty clauses, the timeline, and the way all of it connected back to a property that had never been available for sale. I set each item down in sequence. Then I folded my hands on the table and waited. James did not reach for anything immediately. He looked at the materials laid out in front of him, the way a careful person looks at something when they want to understand its full dimensions before they begin engaging with the details. Then he picked up the financial summary and read it. Then the acquisition contract. Then the dismissal order. He read without speaking. The coffee shop moved around us in its ordinary way, the espresso machine, the low conversation of the other tables, the sound of the door opening and closing as people came in and out of the Wednesday morning. 15 minutes passed. Perhaps a little more. He set down the last document and looked up. In 30 years of professional life, I have sat across from a great many people at a great many tables and watched them arrive at their understanding of a situation. There is a particular expression that appears on a person's face when they have grasped not just the facts in front of them, but the full weight of what those facts represent, not only what happened, but what it means, and what it could mean for other people in other circumstances who will never have access to what I had access to. James Okafor had that expression. "How soon can we start?" he said. I looked at him across the small table in the West Nashville morning light, with 47 videos and a paper trail that went back further than anyone had anticipated sitting between us. "Whenever you are ready," I said. "I have been ready for 8 months. I was up before the sun. Not from anxiety. I had moved past anxiety some weeks ago, at some point between the gala and the hearing and the Wednesday morning on Charlotte Avenue, when I had laid everything on a table and watched a careful man understand its weight. What woke me that Thursday was something closer to the feeling I used to get before a significant ruling, a sharpness, a clarity, the particular alertness of a mind that knows the day ahead requires its full attention. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky over the back garden move through its stages, the deep gray before dawn, then the thin line of pale along the eastern ridge, Then the slow arrival of a November morning that was cold and clear and entirely indifferent to the significance of what was about to happen. That indifference was, in its way, a comfort. The world was not going to mark this day. That was not what this day was for. At 7 o'clock, my phone showed a message from Meg. Filed. One word. That was all it needed to be. Margaret Holloway had walked into the Davidson County Courthouse that morning at the moment the clerk's office opened and submitted a formal criminal complaint on my behalf, a document that named specific individuals, cited specific statutes under Tennessee law governing elder financial fraud and the falsification of legal instruments, and attached as supporting evidence a body of material that had taken 2 months, one 17-year-old with a spiral notebook, one estate attorney with a combination lock document case, and one retired federal judge to assemble. The complaint did not shout. Good legal documents never shout. It simply stated, in the precise and unadorned language of Tennessee procedural law, what had been planned, what had been attempted, what evidence supported those conclusions, and what remedies the law provided. While Meg was at the courthouse, a separate filing was moving through the trust administration process, a motion confirming that the irrevocable structure Thomas had put in place 8 years ago remained fully intact, that no petition filed against it had survived legal scrutiny, and that the property at our address was not, and had never been available for acquisition by any outside party. The Pinnacle Group contract, having been executed against an asset that was not legally transferable, was void. The development company had been notified through their legal counsel the previous afternoon. I did not know what conversations had taken place on their end, and I did not particularly need to. By 9 in the morning, 2 envelopes had been prepared by Meg's office and dispatched through the appropriate legal channels. The first went to the attorney of record for my daughter-in-law. It contained a copy of the criminal complaint, a summary of the evidence filed with it, and a letter from Meg outlining the legal position my daughter-in-law now occupied. It was not a threatening letter. Meg does not write threatening letters. It was an informational one, precise, complete, and written in the tone of someone who has already won and is simply making sure the other party understands the current state of affairs. The second envelope went to Raymond Holt at the address listed in his most recent correspondence with the court. Its contents were similar in structure, though the specifics differed to reflect his particular role in the proceeding. His involvement had been documented thoroughly enough that his legal exposure was, in Meg's assessment, considerable. I spent the morning at home. I answered emails. I watered the plants on the back windowsill. I ate lunch at the kitchen table and read 40 pages of a novel I had been meaning to get to for months. I did these things not because I was unaware of what was unfolding across the city, but because there was nothing left for me to do. I had done everything that required doing. The rest was mechanics, the slow, necessary turning of institutional gears that I had set in motion and that would now proceed without requiring my hand on them. At 2:15 in the afternoon, I sent Lily a message. It's done. She responded within 30 seconds, a single line that told me she was in class and had been waiting. I smiled at my phone and set it face down on the table. I learned what happened at 3 o'clock from Meg, who had received a call from my daughter-in-law's attorney late that afternoon. Sloan had been reached by her legal counsel at approximately 2:45. The envelope had been delivered to the attorney's office that morning and held until the client could be present. She had come in at 3. She had read the complaint in the attorney's conference room, sitting across from a lawyer who had spent that morning reviewing documents he had not previously seen and who was now, by all indications, substantially revising his understanding of the case he had been retained to handle. Sloan had read every page. Her attorney had told Meg's office that his client had no statement at this time. I thought about that no statement at this time and found it about as complete a response as the situation could have produced. She had built her entire enterprise on words, on the careful, calibrated use of language to construct a version of reality that served her purposes. She had narrated my home and my life and my competence to millions of people without pausing to consider that the woman in the blue cardigan might have her own account of events. Now she had read that account, 53 pages of it, organized by date, signed by attorneys, and submitted to a court of law, and she had nothing to say. I set down my coffee cup. Outside, the November afternoon was fading early the way it does in Tennessee, once the season has turned the light pulling back from the garden, the oak trees going dark against a sky that had gone the color of pewter. It was the same back garden I had looked out at the morning after the gala, standing in Thomas's study, beginning to understand the shape of what was coming. I understood its shape completely now. It was done. Meg called me at 6:15. I was in the sitting room by then, the same room where Sloane had set up her ring light 2 weeks earlier and directed me to a chair and filmed 40 minutes of content she believed would serve her purposes. The lamps were on. The room was warm. Outside, the November dark had come down fully over the street, and the neighborhood had settled into its evening quiet. Meg's voice, when she spoke, had the particular quality it carries when she is conveying something significant and has decided to convey it plainly. Her attorney called 20 minutes ago, she said. I thought you should hear this directly. What followed was a reconstruction assembled from what Sloane's attorney had told Meg, from what the parking attendant at the building had observed, from the small details that accumulate around a moment even when no one intends to document them. I have spent enough years working with reconstructed accounts to know that they are never perfect, but they, when assembled carefully, true enough. Sloane had left her attorney's office at 3:45. She had taken the envelope with her. She had walked to the parking structure on the next block, taken the elevator to the 3rd level, unlocked her car, and sat down in the driver's seat. She had not started the engine. She had opened the envelope again. She had already read it once, in the conference room, with her attorney present and the particular constraint of that setting, the professional furniture, the fluorescent light, the presence of another person watching her face pressing down on her reactions. What she had done in that room was read. What she did in the car, alone, was understand. The first thing she would have encountered, turning back to the opening pages, was the trust documentation. Not a summary, the actual instrument, the one Thomas had drafted and signed 8 years ago, with the specific provisions that made the property at our address legally untransferable under any circumstances short of a court order that no legitimate court was going to issue. She had built her entire plan around a house she had never actually had access to. The foundation of everything she had constructed, the debt arrangement, the acquisition contract, the medical petition, the 8 months of careful preparation, rested on a piece of paper that had been in place since before she had ever set foot in Nashville. The second thing was the Pinnacle Group notification. Their legal counsel had formally voided the acquisition contract that same morning, citing the trust instrument and the absence of any legal basis for the transfer. The penalty clause she had been so concerned about, the $500,000 she would owe if the sale did not close, had been rendered unenforceable by the same voiding. Pinnacle had also, according to a note in the filing, formally severed their relationship with the intermediary who had brought them the property opportunity. That intermediary was not named in the document, but Sloane would have known who it referred to. The third section concerned Raymond Holt. His cooperation with the investigating authority had been noted in the complaint, along with the nature of the information he had provided in exchange for consideration in his own legal exposure. He had confirmed the arrangement. He had confirmed the timeline. He had confirmed the communication he had received, instructing him on the specific conclusions his evaluation was expected to reach. He had provided, in other words, everything a prosecutor would need to establish that the petition had not been an independent medical judgment, but a coordinated step in a deliberate scheme. The fourth element was the evidentiary record, a summary of what had been preserved and submitted. 47 recorded videos, archived in their original form with metadata intact, the audio recording from the sitting room, the acquisition contract, the financial records Lily had compiled, the correspondence, all of it cataloged, all of it attributed, all of it describing, in aggregate, a plan that had been running for the better part of a year and had been documented almost as long. 2 million people had watched her channel. She had built that following on the premise that she was a woman who showed up for her family, who cared for the vulnerable, who understood what it meant to be present for the people who needed her. Every video was still accessible, and every video was now evidence. The fifth thing, the last page of the summary section, was a short paragraph listing the name and contact information of a criminal defense attorney in Nashville, whom Meg had identified as appropriate given the nature of the charges. It was not a gesture of hostility. It was practical information, included because a person facing a criminal complaint needs representation, and because providing it was the kind of thing you do when you want the process to proceed correctly rather than chaotically. Her attorney told Meg that Sloane had remained in the parking structure for 45 minutes after leaving the office. During that time, no calls had been placed from her phone, No messages had been sent. The attendant, leaving for the evening, had noted her car still on the third level and had paused long enough to confirm the occupant was present and unharmed before continuing on his way. She had simply sat there. She sat in that car for 45 minutes, Meg told me. She didn't make a single call. I sat with that for a moment. I did not feel what I might have expected to feel, not satisfaction, not relief, not the particular vindication that comes from being proved right after a long effort. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name. The specific stillness of a thing that has run its course. A clock that has reached its end and simply stopped. Sloane Whitfield had spent 8 months constructing a narrative. She had been precise and patient, and in her own way, genuinely skilled. She had understood that the most effective way to take something from a person is to make it appear that you are helping them. She had understood the value of an audience, the power of a presented image, the way that sympathy, carefully cultivated, can become a form of leverage. What she had not understood was that the woman she had chosen was paying attention, had always been paying attention, had been paying attention in courtrooms and conference rooms and across kitchen tables for 40 years before Sloane Whitfield had ever walked through my front door. She had no script for this. And for the first time since I had heard her voice on a recording discussing the timeline of my removal from my own home, she had nothing to say. 3 weeks is not a long time. In the ordinary run of things, 3 weeks is the length of a modest project, a short trip, the time it takes for a garden to show the first real signs of a season changing. In the context of what unfolded in those 3 weeks following day 60, it felt considerably longer not because the days were difficult, but because a great deal happened in them. And each thing that happened had the quality of a door closing quietly but permanently on something that would not be reopened. James Okafor's documentary aired on a Tuesday evening in early December at 9 o'clock on the local Nashville station that had been his professional home for 11 years. The title, which he had settled on after some deliberation and which he had told me about in a brief message the week before broadcast, was simple and precise in the way that the best titles are: The House She Couldn't Sell. Lily arrived at my front door at 8:30, carrying a bag of popcorn she had made at home, and wearing the expression of someone who has waited a long time for a particular evening and intends to be fully present for it. She was 17 years old, and she had spent 6 months of her life carefully documenting a scheme that most adults in her position would have found reasons to ignore. She had earned the popcorn. We settled on the sitting room sofa, in the same room, where Sloane had filmed her final video 2 weeks before everything unraveled. I had thought about that when I arranged the cushions. There was something appropriate about it that I did not feel the need to articulate. The documentary ran 52 minutes. James had done what I had hoped he would do, which was to treat the material with the seriousness it deserved without allowing the seriousness to drain the life from it. He had interviewed 3 other families in Tennessee and Kentucky who had experienced similar patterns: elderly individuals, substantial assets, family members who had used the language of care to pursue outcomes that had nothing to do with care. He had woven their accounts alongside the documented specifics of what had been attempted against me, using the evidence methodically and without sensationalism. My name appeared twice. My face did not appear at all, which had been my condition for cooperating. What appeared instead was the house, the exterior, the garden, the stone and timber of a structure that Thomas had built to outlast both of us, alongside the documents, the timeline, and the clear, unhurried explanation of how the mechanism had worked and why it had failed. Sloane was not named directly in the broadcast. That was a legal decision, not a journalistic one. The criminal proceedings were ongoing, and James had been appropriately careful. But the shape of what had been attempted was described in sufficient detail that anyone who had followed her online presence would have had little difficulty drawing the relevant conclusions. I watched the entire program without speaking much. Lily sat beside me and was, for most of it, equally quiet, the focused quiet of someone paying close attention, rather than the uncomfortable quiet of someone who does not know what to say. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, when James was laying out the financial structure of the scheme and the patient, accessible way he had developed over years of explaining complicated things to general audiences, she reached over and took a handful of popcorn without looking away from the screen. That small, ordinary gesture made me smile in a way I had not expected. The program ended at 9:52. The station went to its standard late news. I held the remote and did not immediately change the channel. What I had learned over the course of those 3 weeks from Meg's updates, from the information that moved through legal channels, from the occasional message that Daniel passed along, assembled itself in my mind in the silence after the documentary ended. The response to the broadcast had been, by any measure, substantial. Within the first full day after the program aired, Sloane's online following had decreased by more than 1,300,000. The reduction had been swift and largely self-sustaining, the kind of collective withdrawal that happens when an audience feels that the trust embedded in a public relationship has been broken in a fundamental way. 4 companies that had provided financial support to her content operation formally ended those arrangements within 48 hours of the broadcast, citing brand alignment concerns in the careful corporate language that means something simpler and more direct. Marcus Webb, the private lender to whom Sloane owed $340,000, had filed for immediate repayment the morning after day 60, before the documentary aired, when the voiding of the Pinnacle contract had made the collateral arrangement behind the loan functionally worthless. That process was moving through its own channels now, separate from the criminal matter but running alongside it. Daniel had called me the morning after day 60, not about the documentary, which had not yet aired, but about a decision he had already made. He told me quietly, without drama, that he had retained an attorney of his own and would be filing the appropriate paperwork. He did not ask for my opinion, which told me he had thought it through carefully enough that he did not need it. I told him I was glad he had called. We agreed to have dinner the following Sunday. He had come, in the end, to the right conclusions on his own timeline. That was how it needed to happen. Lily set the empty popcorn bag on the cushion beside her and looked at me. "Is it over?" she asked. I looked at the television, the news anchor moving through the evening stories, the ordinary machinery of a city's Tuesday night, continuing without particular reference to any of what had just been broadcast. Then I pointed the remote at the screen and turned it off. The room went quiet. "The part that needed to be," I said. "Yes." Spring comes to Nashville the way Thomas used to enter a room quietly, without announcement, and then suddenly everywhere at once. By the middle of April, the dogwoods along the front drive had opened fully, the white blooms so dense against the morning sky that the whole property seemed to be holding its breath between one season and the next. I had been watching for them since March, the way I watch for things I have learned to appreciate precisely because they do not last the particular combination of light and temperature that produces that flowering, that specific 10 days or 2 weeks when the world along the front of this house looks the way it does in the best photographs Thomas ever took of it. He used a film camera. He was the last person I knew who refused to give it up. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee and the morning quiet when the envelope caught my eye. It was not new. I had placed it there the evening before, after going through the filing cabinet in Thomas's study for the first time in years, working my way through the folders he had organized and labeled in the careful block print of a man who expected his systems to outlast him. The envelope was a plain one, letter-sized, with my name on the front in his handwriting. Inside was the original trust instrument, not the copy Meg had reviewed, not the version filed with the court, but the first one, the one Thomas had placed in my hands across his desk 8 years ago and watched me read. I had not opened it since the day he gave it to me. I poured a second cup of coffee and sat back down. The Whitfield Foundation had been Meg's idea. Initially, or rather, she had been the one to say out loud what I had been thinking since the morning James Okafor looked up from a table covered in evidence and asked how soon we could start. The foundation was a small thing, at first. A legal aid organization, staffed by volunteer attorneys from across Middle Tennessee, dedicated to providing representation to elderly individuals facing financial exploitation through family relationships, estate manipulation, or fraudulent competency proceedings. We had named it for Thomas, which he would have found embarrassing and which I found entirely appropriate. In the 4 months since its formal establishment, it had taken on 11 cases. I thought about that number on spring mornings more than I expected to. 11 families. 11 situations that had reached the point of formal legal jeopardy before anyone with the right knowledge and the right resources had been able to intervene. 11 people who had found themselves in the position I had been in, not confused, not incapable, not fragile, but simply alone in a circumstance that had been engineered to make them appear all of those things. The letter from James had arrived the previous week. He wrote to tell me that the documentary had been nominated for a National Journalism Award in the category of public interest reporting. He wrote it in his direct, unembellished way, a paragraph of factual information, a second paragraph saying he was glad the work had mattered, and a closing line noting that the 3 families whose stories had appeared alongside mine in the broadcast had each reached out to the foundation in the months since. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. I had written back to congratulate him. I had also told him that if he ever came across another story that required the kind of documentation only a retired federal judge with 40 years of patience could provide, he was welcome to call. He had replied, "I'll keep that in mind." Lily had received her acceptance letter from Vanderbilt Law School 2 weeks earlier, arriving home from her last semester of high school to find it in the mailbox and calling me before she had even gone inside to tell her parents. She had been working on her application essays since November, and she had asked me, in December, to read the personal statement she was submitting. It was about attention, about what it means to pay attention to the people around you, and what it costs when the people who should be paying attention choose not to. I had read it twice and told her it was the best thing I had read all year. She had said, in her measured 17-year-old way, I had good material to work with. Daniel had broken ground on the Thomas Whitfield Community Center in East Nashville 3 weeks ago. The project had been in development since late winter, a renovation of a former warehouse building, modest in scale, designed to house a neighborhood arts program and a small library branch. He had called me when the permits came through, and I had driven out to stand on the sidewalk in front of the building with him on a cold February afternoon and look at what it was going to become. He looked lighter than he had in years. Not unburdened, some weight does not fully lift, and I would not have expected it to, but lighter in the way that people look when they have stopped carrying something that was not theirs to carry in the first place. We had lunch together most Sundays now. I opened the envelope. The trust instrument was 8 pages, printed on the heavy paper Thomas had specified because he said anything worth filing should be worth holding. I did not read it all the way through. I knew its contents better than I knew most documents I had worked with in my professional life. I turned to the final page, the one with the signatures and the notary seal, and below Thomas's signature, in the same handwriting as the envelope, a single line he had added in ink after the document had been formally executed. Not a legal provision, not a technical amendment, just a line. The house is yours, Caro. It always was. Make sure it stays that way. I sat with that for a long while. Thomas had known not the specifics, not the names, not the precise mechanism that would eventually be brought to bear against what he had built, but he had known the general nature of what he was protecting against, the way a structural engineer knows that a building will be tested without knowing the exact form the test will take. He had designed for it anyway. He had put his name at the bottom of 8 pages of careful legal language and then written one line underneath that was not legal language at all, just the plain truth of what he had intended, in case I ever needed reminding. I folded the document along its original creases. I slid it back into the envelope. I had found a blue one the previous evening, heavier stock than the plain original, the color of the jacket I had worn on the day I was first sworn into the federal bench. I sealed it. I carried it to the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light was coming in at the low April angle that Thomas had designed that window to catch, and I set it there. Outside, the dogwoods were doing what they do for their brief and faithful season. The front drive was white with them. The garden was waking. The house stood the way it had always stood, stone and timber, solid and unhurried, built by a man who understood that the things worth keeping require intention, and that intention, properly structured, can outlast almost anything. Thomas was right. He usually was. And I was still here, every quiet, certain inch of me,